Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. Thank you so much for joining me today. We are gonna go even deeper into Venus, even deeper into the relationship between Venus and the Earth. So I just did a lecture 2 weeks ago called Holy Venus. And so if you haven't watched that lecture, you're gonna wanna go and check that out because that lecture is definitely a precursor for this lecture. In this lecture, we're going to be going even deeper into the relationship between Venus and Earth. And we're specifically going to be focusing on exactly how Venus and Earth have enmeshed, and the idea of the entering of soul waves from Venus and streams of energy from Venus into the Earth and the evolutionary purpose and necessity for that, for the Earth's evolution. So let's get into the dynamics of the streams of energy that have entered the Earth from Venus, and also the specific souls that have entered the Earth from Venus, and what exactly that looks like. So over the last year or two, I've been establishing on my channel that the best way to understand human development and evolution, and even planetary development and evolution, and even our cosmos, so even our physical cosmos, the planets and everything, is to understand that when you look at our planet and the solar system, what you're looking at is actually a school. That's the best way to understand and to describe the purpose of everything basically existing. It's one big evolutionary school that's held in planets and stars, and it's called our solar system or our cosmos. Okay, so we're going to get probably the understanding of Earth and Venus is the beginning of understanding our solar system as a school, because it allows us to see how humanity evolves. All humans evolve in the solar system, and how planets evolve directly, which is through the exchanging of energy. Okay, so basically, Venus and the Earth work in tandem together. And Venus can really be seen as like the higher Earth, or the astral Earth, or the Earth's higher self. And Venus will cast down forces into its lower self, so into Venus. This is very similar as to in the human system, where you can receive from the astral plane forces through the crown chakra into the head. It kind of goes into the bloodstream and goes into the energy body, and then we bring it downwards deeper and deeper into matter, into the lowest center we have, which is the root chakra, and into the regenerative forces, and then we bring that back up. And so there's always a cycle of energy that's going like this in our body, and we become awakened and we become aware. We are able to do this consciously, and we're able to basically become aware that this is actually going on in our system, and understand health and development based in the reality that we're constantly cycling spiritual energy, making it physical, and then spiritualizing it again. And so this is very much an example of what happens between Earth and Venus as well. Earth is sort of like the lower materialized, dense version of Venus. It's a denser version of the planetary stage that we know as Venus, or the plane that is Venus, or the planet that we know as Venus. And again, the sphere that we see in the sky, or the planet that we see in the sky, that's not really Venus. Like, that is a representation or a shell or a placeholder of the Venusian energy in this third dimension. So Venus is inhabited. Venus has a life wave and a life cycle, just like the Earth does, but it's not in the third dimensional plane. Okay, now every planet is like that. That's why the solar system is a school. It's just that the planets that you see, they don't have life in the same dimension and time space as us. Okay? And there's a certain rhythm to the cosmos, sort of like the opening and closing of gates and windows, that directly is to do with the evolution of the cosmos itself, right? It's not something that humanity controls. It's not something that the human being can create or control. It's something that naturally happens that we align with, that there's meaning to, right? So what becomes ripe on Venus, if you can think about like an apple, what fruit becomes ripe on Venus passes down or is cast down to the earth. And then it is eaten on the earth, or it is taken in on the earth. It is given form on the earth, worked upon on the earth. And the earth is a denser environment. It's more dualistic. There's more polarity. It's heavier. And so that is then worked out upon the earth. And then we digest it. And again, it comes back up and it goes back up to Venus. All right, so this is the wave you go. You have something that is ripe on Venus, something that is ready, something that has reached a certain evolutionary point on Venus, whether it be an energy wave or an energy frequency or a certain group of souls, and they pass down through Venus. They're coming down from Venus, and they come into the earth. And the earth is worked upon, humanity is worked upon, those individuals, those souls also work upon themselves in this new environment. And then they eventually begin to spiritualize things that then make their way back up to Venus. Also, thought forms and thought energies are used in Venus as well. So what is transmuted on the earth and what is created on the earth, especially if it's meaningful. So there's a lot of meaningless creations on the earth, meaning that they don't really represent God. They don't really represent Christ consciousness. They don't really represent anything natural. They're just sort of imbalanced and therefore meaningless creations. And those will dissolve and those sort of get trapped in the lower astral plane because there's not enough truth in them to survive. And so what is holy gets given back up to Venus, and then it goes again and again and again. And this is actually how evolution works in our system, more or less. So what exactly is exchanged between Venus and Earth? Like what exactly is being exchanged? So what is being exchanged is basically energy. So on the most basic level, and Venus is sending Earth energy. It's sending Earth holy energy, Christed energy, sort of a beautiful higher force, inspirational forces. And also thought forms, beautiful inspirations and things like that. That is being sent from Venus to the Earth. This is just waves of forces. Okay. But and this is what we're going to focus on today, there's also souls that reach the earth and come into the earth and live on the earth and, go through a whole process with the earth that are technically, they came from Venus. Okay. And that's what we're going to get into today. So you have two things that are really exchanged. You have just pure energetic forces. And this is being hinted at in a lot of spiritual work by saying that, Venus absorbs the sun, and then it keeps 2/3 of that absorption and then gives 1/3 to the earth. So in a sense, how Venus evolves, the beings on Venus and the planetary sphere itself is by being in this very high condition of service where it takes in Christ energy, or the energy of the sun, or the solar spirits, or the solar Petries, or the Father, or the Logos, right? Whatever language you want to use. And then it goes through a period of digestion, steps it down a little bit, makes it a little bit more digestible, and then gives 1/3 of that to the earth. And without that energy, without that force, without that third of life force energy from Venus, the earth would not evolve. The earth would have no upwards evolution. The earth would have no advancement. The earth actually wouldn't be able to perceive the sun in a meaningful way. So that's the importance of Venus. So there were basically different waves of souls that came from Venus. And these souls were called different things when they were either overshadowing or enmeshing with the body, or they were actually incarnated in a body. So there was a process of interaction with souls from Venus that is or the Venusian, or beings from the Venusian sphere, that's very specific. It's an exact science. It's not like we don't know. There's an exact science of how these spheres overlap, what forces can come in, what forces cannot come in, the time period for that overlapping, and how exactly those souls are to evolve. This is a science. This is the science of human and angelic evolution. So it's not something that's out there that we can't perceive. No, this is something that we can absolutely and have to understand moving forward. So in esoteric literature, the beings from Venus were called many different things. In Theosophy, they call them the Lords of Venus, the Lords of the Flame, the Children of the Fire Mist. In the Eastern science, they were called the 7 Rishis. They were referred to as the sons of Brahma, the Dhyani Buddhas, and the progression of Buddha and Bodhisattva was all in relationship to spiritual forces from Venus being worked upon and into man. So the whole structure of the Buddha and human initiation is to do with Venus. They cannot be separated. Also, the Bharishads or the Arhats are also referring to these souls from Venus, that soul essence from Venus. You'll also find an anthroposophy that Rudolf Steiner will connect them with the angelic hierarchy directly, and a special function of the spiritual hierarchies, the spiritual hierarchy's own evolution in the solar system. And in anthroposophy, it's just mentioned quite plainly. And, Rudolf Steiner just says, yes, there was angels that came from Venus, or angels that came from Mercury. There were angels that came even from Mars. And the secret of Mars, Venus, and Mercury we'll get into in a different day, but that's all fundamentally coming from the same force. There's really it's just really that one force and different evolutions of itself. So we'll get into that in another day, but I'm just saying this so that you can recognize the language and see that this teaching has existed in obviously the Eastern esoteric sciences, ancient Hinduism and the Eastern traditions. They really didn't hold back on the planet, the idea of the lords from Venus and things like this. They really taught it. The 7 Rishis, of course, were the 7 great spirits from Venus. And even Rudolf Steiner mentions that the Buddha, the soul of the Buddha, the Buddha actually is a soul from Venus, and so is Christ. Okay, so we're getting to really see and understand that these forces from Venus, that these souls that came from Venus, that gave their spark to humanity are great initiators. Okay. So let's get into a little bit more in detail about when these waves from Venus started to come in and what exactly that means and how to interpret it, because unfortunately, this topic has been misinterpreted and turned into something that really doesn't represent reality at all, which is really the problem with dealing with topics that deal with interdimensionality and shifts in dimension and the soul, is that it's very difficult sometimes for our minds to interpret our own memories of this or interpret spiritual teachings. We automatically want to make it as physical as possible, which means that we lose nuances and we don't understand it. And then there's so many teachings in the New Age and modern spirituality that just completely profane this. And so I want to get into that as well. Okay, so if you look into the Eastern tradition, so the Eastern spiritual science, theosophy and anthroposophy, what is described is basically two waves of souls from Venus. And each wave brought something different to the Earth, because each wave was really representing a different time of Venus and a different aspect of Venus. And we have to keep in mind that, you know, as the Earth is evolving, right, so are all the other planets in their own way. You know, we're sort of, you know, locked in this evolutionary time, right? And so everything is evolving. Evolution is law, growth is law. And so if you have one wave coming from Venus in early human development, and then you have another wave coming from Venus in later human development, those two waves are going to offer something, they're going to be different, okay? They're not different in an extreme way or a crazy way. They just served a different purpose for humanity, and the quality of beings would have been different as well, okay? So the two great waves of souls from Venus came millions of years ago. The first wave came around 18 million years ago, and the second wave came about 6.5 million years ago. Okay, so the first wave from Venus was very, very, very early in human development, and that's placed around the Lemurian epoch. So Venus really starts to overlap and engage with humanity as soon as humanity begins to take a physical form. Before humanity actually began to enter physicality, there were sort of different forces and there's a different kind of way of life and a different interaction with the solar system, if you will, and different beings. But the moment that we entered physicality, which was about halfway through the Lemurian epoch, which a lot of esotericists will place around 18 million years ago or so, that is when you start to see this influx of souls from Venus. And these souls from Venus were there to really establish a ladder of initiation back up into the higher planes. So really what had happened was that humanity was beginning to fall deeper and deeper and deeper into matter, deeper and deeper, deeper into density. That's where that Lemurian epoch is a fascinating time on the Earth to study, is because we were sinking fast into matter. We finally got our physical form, and that was where Venus locked in and began directly interacting with the Earth. Okay, that's when we received the first wave of initiates and spiritual forces and the first souls from Venus. Okay, and these souls sort of the biggest thing that they did was they personified higher forces and higher patterns. So you'll often see them as being portrayed as personifying the different rays of consciousness, which is what the seven great rishis are. And very well, there's the Kumaras and things like this, is that they were there to basically personify spiritual forces so that man could still interact with them and still perceive them, because the risk of sinking really far, far, far deeper and deeper into matter was that cognitively or spiritually, we wouldn't really be able to understand ourselves in the solar system, in the cosmos. There was a real risk of that. And where humanity was going in its overall evolution was to develop our I, our individuality, and to have our own soul. Before the about halfway through the Atlantean epoch, we didn't really have souls like we do now. We really didn't have an I or an individuality, and our soul was really more like, it was more like an animal collective consciousness. We weren't an animal, but we still didn't have that sense of individuality, and we didn't have that sense of independence. That came around moving from the Atlantean epoch into the post-Atlantean epoch. That's the period where we really begin to get that I, that individuality, and technically our soul. And we begin to prepare for the personification of the sun, which is the incarnation of Christ, and all that that was going to lead to, which is the spiritualization of our form, eventually out of matter. So all of this is known to higher beings. You know, all of this whole trajectory of evolution is known to higher beings. And so we were sinking so deeply into matter that there needed to be this ladder back up into higher awareness and higher consciousness. And so there were very great beings from Venus that came that basically completely personified spiritual forces. They personified cosmic forces. And they held those forces for humanity, so that as humanity began to wake up later, get their I, become more independent, more of an individual, there would be something there for them to tap into, right? Because the problem with sinking deeper and deeper into matter is the earth is suddenly becoming denser and denser and denser. And then there's all these veils that are coming around the earth as well over time. And so those veils have to be broken up, and there has to be enough spiritual forces around the earth and in human consciousness that when humanity begins to become self-aware, conscious, that there are forces there for them to lift themselves up. So this was the first wave of individuals from Venus, of souls from Venus, was really creating a structure of personifying cosmic and spiritual forces, archetypal cosmic forces for man. So really with their own consciousness, they entered the collective consciousness of humanity, and they gave themselves. They gave themselves in a sacrifice, so that when humanity could wake up, there would be this force, this consciousness there, but they had to sacrifice themselves to do that. Now, this is portrayed in the sleeping hero myths, the sleeping king myths, and the idea of the sleepers, okay, the great sleepers in the earth. These are the great Venusian beings, the great Venusian essences that basically sacrifice their own soul, their own essence, to create a protective, etheric shell around the earth, so that when humanity would wake up, this presence would be there. If this presence was not there, then humanity would never understand who they were. They'd never have an essence there to remember. There'd be nothing of Christ there for them to pull in, okay? So this is also where you can see it as really the beginning of the forces in the cosmos that are known as the Great White Brotherhood, the White Lodge. This is where you get all of the teachings about these higher etheric cities, like the city above the Gobi or the Himalayas, and you get these teachings that are all about these spiritual centers that are partially physical and then partially astral and etheric, and they basically exist around these sleeping kings or these high Venusian entities, these souls that came from Venus to the earth in very early times. Now, we would call them gods, we would call them angels, but I really have to state that what a lot of people think are gods and people's idea of angels is very either very simple and very basic, and it's not from an evolutionary place, or it's basically just only paying attention to fallen angels, which we're going to get into a little bit in this lecture as well. So ultimately, what these great spirits were doing was they were building a ladder of initiation back up to Venus and then through Venus to the sun. So that's really what they were doing, but they were doing it with their own consciousness, with their own essence. Okay, that is love, that is devotion, that is not a selfish act, that is complete selflessness. All right. So, and this is another thing too we have to understand about life on the Venusian sphere is that when you get to that level of development, if you want to go further in the solar system school, if you want to go further, it actually takes acting sacrificially. That's why on Earth, so much of the preparation, spiritual preparation, is trying to get students and people to focus on service, because truly service and sacrifice for the whole in the higher spheres of evolution, that's what it's all about. That's how you actually become a god. That's how you actually become a solar being, a solar entity. That's how you actually totally, completely get out of any form of matter, is through service and through sacrifice. It's the only way. Okay, so these are very advanced souls. They would technically be, angelic forces from the angelic hierarchy. They're spiritual forces that are on their own evolutionary path. And they're basically using their own consciousness, their own forces to unite the earth with the higher planes. They're creating a bridge with their own consciousness, with their own being. And they're uniting the earth, which was falling very quickly into matter and forgetfulness, with Venus and thus with the sun, creating a clear and usable, workable channel that can uplift the earth. Okay, so that is the great mystery and the great secrets about the first wave of Venusian adepts. And the same thing happens again later. And there's lots of very deep rituals and mythology and stories and veiled experiences that directly reference this. And we'll definitely go deeper into those in this series as well, though not today. The second wave of Venusian souls was from a different round of Venus. So it was from Venus in a different evolutionary phase. And that came about 6.5 million years ago. So really looking at the end of Lemuria, going into Atlantis kind of situation. And what those soul essences did was they sort of furthered the structure of the initial wave of Venus. They furthered that structure. They continued with teaching and trying to uplift humanity so that they could make a connection to the spark that was forming in humanity so that they could uplift themselves with solar consciousness and higher consciousness. So they're basically teachers, initiators, and there wasn't necessarily the same option to completely sacrifice, your entire being for another planet, but this is getting more into the mundane and spiritualizing the mundane, and getting really into that more mundane level of development. That's the second wave of Venus, where the first wave was really just creating the structure, making sure there's a ladder to Venus from the Earth, and making sure all that existed. And then the second wave animates all of that and tries to make it practical, tries to make it real, and begins to establish higher patterns of life on the planet, higher ways of living that actually lead to evolution. But of course, there's different rules around this. There's rules that must be followed. Okay, so another way to view these Venusian beings, and they are human. So we're not talking about like some of the ways that aliens are portrayed or anything. These are not aliens. These are human beings that are part of the solar system school that are just as human as you and I. They just have slightly different faculties developed. Okay. Another way to see them as is as angels. And I'm using the term angel in the anthroposophical term. And in anthroposophy, it is observed that even the spiritual hierarchies themselves are evolving. Okay. And so an angel is really just like a divine man. So to us, to human beings, an angel is a divine man. And they reach their human stage where we are in a past level of development. So they're kind of like one ahead of us, and they're going on their own evolutionary journey, as we're going to see as well, because we all know that there was a period in time where certain angels fell. Okay. And so we're seeing that. And what we're talking about is sort of like divine human beings, because they reached their human stage where we are in a prior planetary development. Okay. And that's why they evolved now by helping out someone who was in their stage prior. Okay. See how that solar system school exchange works? Okay. So in that way, the Venusians are like one cycle ahead, if you will. So they're not perfect. They're not God itself. They're one ahead. All right. So that's important to know. And it's funny because there are some statements in theosophy that sort of call out different people, and they say, oh, Plato was a fifth rounder Venusian, or they'll say these different things, because deep in these mystery schools, they're extremely aware of Venus, they're extremely aware of everything that I'm saying, and there's an actual pattern of tracking souls and different people, seeing how much of that essence is within them. All of that people understood that deep in the mystery schools. They understood that that was the animating force. Okay. So yes, there was a point where I think they called Plato a fifth rounder from Venus, meaning that Plato's soul was essentially from Venus when Venus was in the fifth or fourth round or something like that. And so people would, I guess, talk about that, which was really interesting, actually. Okay, so this is how human and planetary evolution works, is that there are forces sent from a higher, more advanced sphere, right? And they work with its lower counterpart. And so it's really just an enmeshing of forces, if you will. All right, so this next point is extremely important, because if we don't understand this, we're going to end up conflating our idea of the gods or the idea of angels. We're going to end up conflating our idea of the great initiators, and we're not going to get anywhere. So what we have to understand is that in earlier phases of the earth, so when the earth was in much more of an etheric condition, significantly less material than it is now, the Venusian souls, the Venusian beings, the beings from the Venusian sphere, they actually interacted with humanity in more of a direct way. So humanity at that time, again, was not an individual. It was not, they did not have their I. So we were sort of like children in that sense. And we weren't as separate from the higher planes and from the astral realm. I mean, the etheric realm is just not as far from the astral realm as our physical realm is. And so, you know, in these earlier periods of human evolution, you know, the gods actually walked among us, and they would interact with us in the different cycles of earth development in different ways. Sometimes they would actually walk amongst us, and we would have periods where we would see them and interact with them. And we knew that they were from the Venusian sphere, and we didn't think there was anything weird about that, because at that time, even though we weren't individuals, we understood that the Venusian sphere, and that really any other sphere in the cosmos, is just another developmental system connected to our own in some way. That every single star and planet in our whole cosmos is interconnected with the Earth in some way. There's a relationship back to the Earth or to the Earth in some way. So we didn't see, you know, beings from a different planetary sphere as being weird or anything. We understood the value of it. We understood that we were learning, and we understood initiations only when we begin to get our I and our individuality, and we begin to fall and we start getting egos. That's when we start to really misunderstand the idea of the great spiritual initiators, the idea of gods, the idea of God. We start getting all of that advanced knowledge really messed up, because we get an ego, and we get a negative ego, which affects how we view the spiritual plane. So in these earlier phases of the earth, so we're talking about, you know, especially in Lemuria, the beginning of Lemuria, even to the beginning of Atlantis, even into Atlantis, you know, it's not unusual to have the gods walk amongst you and be learning from them and interacting with them. It also was part of that, to be actually channeling one, or to have, you know, a great initiate, an archangel, if you want to use anthroposophy, or an angel, enter into your bioenergetic field, and that would start to influence your thoughts, influence you, and you would begin to sort of absorb and mesh, and you would be crafted. There would be a sort of, your etheric body and even your physical body and everything about you would start to represent this higher angelic being in your aura. It wasn't forceful, it wasn't dark, it was part of how human beings would develop, would be by enmeshing with and being around these beautiful, benevolent, higher beings that were, at times they were walking amongst us, you know, and at times they were actually enmeshing with us and preparing our physical form, helping us to prepare ourselves for the next stage of evolution. So I'm talking about two different processes there. I'm talking about certain periods or even certain groups of people that could directly interact with these beings from another sphere. Okay? But then I'm also talking about these beings being able to directly enter human beings that are developing. And when they enter human beings, they're entering their astral or etheric body, and they're helping them to, they're gently helping them to evolve. They're not possessing them. They're not controlling them. They're introducing certain frequencies, certain thought forms, things like this that actually help the individuality and actually sort of etch or pattern spiritual thoughts within them. So it's sort of like they're patterning. Okay? And this is very selfless. Like, this is a selfless act. Again, it's a sacrificial act to enter into a lower developing form and to completely give of yourself, your knowledge, your wisdom, to enmesh yourself with a developing developing human, and apply yourself that way lovingly, so that they have a substrata and something to work with. Okay, so that was also going on. And then, so we were interacting like that with higher beings for a long time. And then things changed. Okay, then things changed. So you don't stay in that level forever, because that level was really an infantile level. You know, when you're a child or you're a baby and you are breastfed, right? You have your mom or your dad dress you, and they brush your hair, and they tell you what time to eat and what you're going to eat and what you can watch and what you can't watch. And you have this parental force that's basically taking care of you and making sure that you don't hurt yourself, because you don't yet understand the situation that you're in. You don't yet understand your little body. You don't yet understand yourself. And so you have these sort of parental forces that do understand that, and they try to guide you lovingly to a place over time where hopefully you develop being able to care for yourself. And hopefully, as a child, you are prepared and raised properly and nourished in a way where when you get to that adulthood stage, you know, you have enough within you that you can become a healthy and functioning adult. Okay, so that was really the role of these Venusian souls that came. Was, you know, humanity was basically in an infantile condition, and they were raising humanity as a parental force, as a loving force, as a mothering force in the very beginning, and as a fathering force in the very beginning, going through different cycles of that. And then things changed. The earth evolved. Humanity evolved. Venus evolved. The angels who were doing this work were also evolving. And don't forget, once these angelic beings, these gods, once they enter the earth's aura, once they enter the earth's body, they are subject to all of the density, all of the harshness, all of the polarity, all of the darkness that humanity is. They're not beyond that. They're not above that. They're subject to everything that is going on in the earth. And so they're changing too. They're not the same forces that they were in the beginning of their cycles either. Okay, because also remember that even these higher divine beings from Venus, they weren't perfect. They were also, you know, by helping humanity, they also sought to know themselves better as well. And so they're also on this journey of trying to understand themselves and develop their individuality as well. So there's a learning curve here with these beings that we have to keep in mind.
So